Hello, I'm Adam Grimes, and welcome to MarketLife Chart School. So in this short video, I'm going to answer a question I got. Somebody's asking on this daily chart of Apple, is this an anti-pattern? And to answer that, let's talk about the anti-pattern in general. So this pattern has a indicator definition, but I find this, the way I think about it in terms of market structure, is that does not usually need the indicator. So what we're looking for here, markets trend like this, some variation of this. This is a very idealized look at a market trend, but you have these with trend legs, and they're interspersed with pullbacks against the trend. And typically there will be some degree of regularity to these. When the market is trending, the uptrend legs will be longer than the downtrend legs, will generally show a little bit more momentum and conviction. And that's one way we read the integrity of a trend. One of the ways a trend ends is with a sharp surprise move against the trend. So what you start to see is a down, and this is, we're looking at an uptrend here, but you see a down leg that looks, and you have to put that in quotes, looks very different than the pullbacks that we've seen before. And this type of subjective analysis is actually valid. I know it seems strange to talk about the way a market pattern looks or a market pattern makes us feel, but really what is happening is we're responding to the emotions of market participants and the way that it results in price movement. And so understanding that from a subjective standpoint is a very powerful analytical tool. Now, once you have this situation, several things typically happen. You can have, of course, a very quick recovery and the market heads higher. This is what we've seen in stocks all through 2016, 2017. Every single time we've had a potential short setup, market's just shrugged it off and headed higher. That certainly is an outcome. Another thing that does happen, and this is where we start to get interested in shorting, is if the bounce is then what I have characterized as a reluctant bounce. It just kind of goes sideways for a little while. This typically will set up a sell-off. And this is what we're looking for as the anti-pattern. So we have an established trend. We have a strong counter-trend shock. This is one, this is two. And then the third thing is we have a reluctant bounce that we think has a high probability of setting up another leg down. Without all of these pieces, we don't have a very convincing trade. So let's go over and look at Apple. Do we have this? And this is the question. So we're looking at this sell-off here. And I would argue that compared to that previous scenario that I just showed you, this is nowhere near enough downward momentum. And this is a case where an indicator can be helpful. Look at the MACD, doesn't come anywhere near making a new low relative to recent data. So what we have here is now in the market this particular market may still very well go down. We have this long consolidation that's probably some kind of bear flag. We have had new momentum here, new downside momentum here. And this is perhaps functioning a little bit more, if we wanted to label patterns, what I might call a nested pullback. But to me, because this is not really the first shock after an attempted trend change, this is not really an anti-pattern on the daily chart. And again, you may trade these from a similar perspective. You might look at this and you might say, okay, so this, let me zoom out, sorry. This pullback here has broken down. Now we have a small consolidation and I can short under that. And so you might get to the same place that we might think about with an anti-pattern, but it's not a textbook example of the anti. However, let's look at the weekly chart because this is kind of interesting. So if we look at the weekly chart of Apple, we have a clear established uptrend. And if we go back a little bit in history, we have a weekly shock here. I'm going to erase that so you can see the price bars a little bit more clearly. That is a little bit out of proportion to what we've seen in the previous pullback. Not incredibly, though. It's important to note that a stock like this will have some pretty large shocks and then continue to the upside. And then we have this kind of reluctant bounce that resolves easily to the upside. So that was, I mentioned that scenario before. But now look at what has happened recently. On the weekly chart, now we have this type of another strong sell-off. And yes, there's some MACD divergence here, but I don't find that to be a showstopper for a trade like this. There are times that it can speak very clearly, as I showed you on the daily, to point out that we don't have a lot of downward momentum, but it doesn't necessarily contradict the trade. And then we have a reluctant bounce. And this, on the weekly chart, is a typical ante. So we had a question here asking about the ante on the daily chart, and I don't really see that. But we do have, maybe not one of the best examples, but we do have a good example on the weekly. This is a pattern that, one of the things that happens, people tend to find themselves fading moves, going against trend, something's going up, you're always finding an excuse to get short. That can be very painful and not very profitable, but this pattern is one way that you can do that effectively. And by the way, go to MarketLifeTrading.com and check out the latest course module that will cover the ante and talk about the ante. And this, we'll get into this pattern in some detail. And if you don't already use it, you might consider adding it to your trading plan. Thank you very much. Check out MarketLifeTrading.com.